some sort of URL here that actually attaches itself to, that is read through the browser itself, and inject the malicious code into the victim's browser here. So let's go ahead and move on to the app.js. So we'll have to replace this specific script. Instead of using document.write, we'll have to find an alternative method to render this URL on the app. So let's go ahead into the app.js, and if we scroll a little further here, we'll also see that our cookie does have a max age and SemSide property, but we're missing a couple of other properties that could be used in order to secure our cookies. So we can add something as well to that. Further down, where we're actually sending a post request into the review, where we're storing our reviews, we'll see that at the moment we're actually storing the reviews in an empty array here locally. We got to be careful with how they're stored, because some attack could be passed into the way we're writing a review, and once submitted, it could be stored in our server. And whenever someone accesses the stored reviews, if there is a malicious code like a script attack or something, that script itself will be rendered in within the GET request when a visitor goes and accesses the reviews, and that malicious code will be executed attacking the victim's browser. So instead of actually having us store any kind of code, we have to validate some of the data before we actually process it in the back end. Okay, let's move on to task number 2, where we're going to validate and sanitize some data. So as I said earlier, Restreview is currently storing all the reviews locally, and the form to submit reviews is vulnerable to malicious code being injected into the server. So we're going to begin by importing the check method from the express validator at the top of the app.js file. If we scroll all the way to the top, we'll see that we already have validation result imported. So in order to actually import a method from a package itself, all we need to do is wrap the method itself in curly brackets so it'll extract it from the library. Since we already have validation result, we can simply extract check, and now we'll have access to the check method here, and we can use it when we're validating some of the data in our review request here. Okay, we can move on to step number 3. We'll be using Express Validator to ensure that the following data matches the format below. So here's where we'll be adding the middleware to validate the email and restaurant info. Now, if you're unaware of how Express Validator works, there are different kind of methods we can use to validate certain data. We're going to be using it as middleware here, and we're adding it as an array before the request and response is actually processed. You'll see after we actually pass the middleware within our callback, we actually have an errors variable that will check for the result validation to make sure that all the requests that we sent are actually valid, and store them, and store, if they're not, then store any of the errors in an array. So if there are errors found, we're actually going to redirect the results to a page called error. And if there are no errors found, implying that all the data was valid, we'll be console logging a message that says data was valid and redirecting to the success page. So here in this middleware, we'll be validating all of our data. So we know that we're going to be passing an email address, a type of restaurant, which is from a drop-down menu, a rating, which has 5 ratings, and a string, which is a review. If you want to explore a little further how this is built, you can go into the EJS file and scroll a little further down into like the form method here. Well, you'll see different types of inputs and labels and option values here. So an attacker could essentially manipulate this information before it's sent to the server and insert any kind of malicious code and have it be ready to send any kind of code into a victim's browser. So let's prevent that by validating the data before it even reaches the backend. Okay, so we want to know that the email is actually formatted as an email. And there's a very useful way of doing this. Now, before I move forward, if you haven't used Express Validator before, I highly recommend that you guys go into the documentation, which we'll take a quick look here. And one thing that's important to take note of is that Express Validator is actually middlewares that wraps Validator.js, which is another library, and sanitizer functions. So this has a lot of functions and different types of methods where you can customize how data is validated. It's very flexible, and you can do a lot of different things into how you want to format your data or process it. One of the common ones that is used is the check method, which we can look over here. Take a look at it quickly. Uh, Here it is under the API validation middlewares. Here you'll see that the check takes in two parameters, the first one being the field. So if we're passing in a review of a restaurant and one of the fields has the field of email, that would be the first parameter here. The way check works, it looks for any of the fields that are attached within the following request objects. So all these fields that we're going to be creating are going to be retrieved from a request object. Now we have different types of validations that we can add, and you'll see some examples here. Also, in case you don't find the exact information within the documentation here, you can also just go straight into the GitHub of validator.js, and you'll have a handy list of all the methods that are available there. So all these methods that are listed here in validator.js should be available from Express dash validator. So if we want to check if something is an email, we still have access to the isEmail function here. Now, there will be a few other ones that we're going to be using, so make sure to navigate both the documentation for Express Validator and validator.js. So back here in our project, first thing we're going to do is we want to check that the email is an actual email. So we can do that by calling our function check, passing in the field email, and simply calling the isEmail function here. Make sure you add a comma because we're going to be using the other fields here. Now for the restaurant, we want to make sure that it's not empty and that it blacklists the characters of the carrots, the left and the right one. So we'll use check. We'll pass in restaurant as a field. We want to make sure that is not empty. We can do this with a method called notEmpty. And remember that you can also chain commands here. So we can simply add the blacklist method here, and in the method for blacklist, I'm missing the L here, we can simply pass in the characters that we want to omit. So blacklist will essentially clear out or remove any of the characters that we pass in as a parameter, and it will pass in the input field into our server or backend without the characters. So we're kind of doing two things at once. Here we're checking that the field here that is passed in is not empty and that it removes these characters as well. Okay, for the rating, we want to make sure that it's, this has to be check rating. We want to make sure that it's numeric, so we can call the isNumeric function. And no, I haven't memorized all these functions. I looked them up prior on the GitHub, and I'm using them here for our project. So, in a normal kind of situation, you would be going back and forth trying to look for the best methods that fit your criteria for validation. Okay, so lastly, we'll check the review. And we want to make sure that it's not empty, and similar to the restaurant field, we're going to blacklist the same characters. So we can actually just copy this here, pass it in there as well. Okay, now this middleware will be added into our post request, and it will be processed anytime this request is hit. And if any of these fields is not valid, then it should redirect us to an error page. If they're all valid, then we should be successfully redirected to the success page. Okay, let's move on to step number 4. We're going to be protecting the DOM here. So the intern currently wrote code in home EJS that exposes a DOM-based vulnerability by making use of document.write. So let's go over here, scroll all the way up to the script here, and we can see that we're using document.write and adding a specific HTML here along with some JavaScript code here by using document.base URI. So we're going to find an alternative method way of writing the content into the DOM. We're going to start by creating a new HTML tag with the ID URL info. The reason we're going to do this is we're going to be actually using JavaScript here to target an element within our HTML and then use that to replace the text within it, as opposed to doing it directly within the script tags. So we can do that here, right it below our body here. There's many ways you can do that. I'm just going to use bold tag here that says current URL. And right next to the current URL, I am going to add a span here. The span can be empty because we're going to be targeting and then replacing the text within it. Let's just make sure we add an ID of it called to URL info. And that's it for step number 4. So now that we have a separate HTML tag with a specific ID, we can use getElementById to target that object and use text content instead of write in order to assign it to the base URI. So let's get rid of this here. Let me get rid of this here, this chunk here. So we're going to get the element by its ID. We know that the ID is URL info. Make sure you add the quotation marks here. And instead of using document.write, we'll use document text content and assign it to the document base URI. So let's refresh this. Let's make sure that it still renders. And you'll see that it's not rendering. The reason that it's not rendering is because we're targeting the element here. We have our script tags at the top. And remember that this HTML and JavaScript is read top to bottom. So we have to move it all the way to the bottom where we have our other script tag here at the bottom, right after our second script for Bootstrap. We can add our script there. Let's refresh this. And now it'll be able to actually find the element by its ID and render the content. And in script tags at the top. And remember that this HTML and JavaScript is read top to bottom. So we have to move it all the way to the bottom where we have our other script tag here at the bottom, right after our second script for Bootstrap. We can add our script there. Let's refresh this. URL info. And that's it for step number 4. So now that we have a separate HTML tag with a specific ID, we can use getElementById to target that object and use text content instead of write in order to assign it to the base URI. So let's get rid of this here. Let me get rid of this here, this chunk here. So we're going to get the element by its ID. We know that the ID is URL info. Make sure you add the quotation marks here. And instead of using document.write, we'll use document text content and assign it to the document base URI. So let's refresh this. Let's make sure that it still renders. And you'll see that it's not rendering. The reason that it's not rendering is because we're targeting the element here. Here we have our script tags at the top. And remember that this HTML and targeting the element here. We have our script tags at the top. And remember that this HTML and JavaScript is read top to bottom. So we have to move it all the way to the bottom where we have our other script tag here at the bottom, right after our second script for Bootstrap. We can add our script there. Let's refresh this. And now it'll be able to actually find the element by its ID and render the content. And in this way, we're actually protecting the app further from a DOM-based vulnerability. Okay, lastly, we're going to be securing our cookies and headers. So let's add a cookie object to the existing session and set the appropriate properties to secure the cookie. So back in our app.js file, if we scroll the way up here where we have our session, we'll see that we already have our cookie set up with a max age and the same side here. And there are two properties that we can add in order to secure our cookie further. One of them is HTTP only. Now, HTTP only prevents the cookie to be accessed on the client side, or for the cookie to be actually used on the browser. Sorry, not used, but accessible on the browser. So we want this to be true. And the other property that we want to add is called secure. This flag allows us, or actually prevents the cookie to be passed in through a simple HTTP request. It will only be able to be accessed or used through HTTPS request. So we want this to also be true. Okay, let's move on to the last step here, where we'll be implementing the Helmet middleware. So now, in order to do this, we simply require the package. It's already installed in your package.json file. So all we need to do is do const helmet equals require helmet here. And in order to actually use it, we simply can add it here above our session by using app.use helmet, and make sure you require, we'll be implementing the Helmet middleware. So now, in order to do this, we simply require the package. It's already installed in your package.json file. So all we need to do is do const helmet equals require helmet here. And in order to actually use it, we simply can add it here above our session by using app.use helmet, and make sure you call the actual library here. Now the helmet library simply secures our Express application by setting various HTTP headers, such as content security policy and XSS filter and a few other ones. Just keep note that it's basically a wrapper of different kind of headers that are configured, and it simply does it in one line for us. So with that complete, we have now added a few layers of security to our application. Now keep in mind, once we add our helmet package here, we have a certain architecture here in Codecademy in the way we're actually displaying the mini browser. So if you add the helmet package here at the end and you refresh the browser, you'll probably notice that the application won't be loading properly. Let me just restart the app here. And that's okay. That's simply the way we're actually rendering certain packages and the way they're linked together in my cause and error here in your mini browser. But you should be rest assured that if you add it in your local environment, it should work properly and secure your application further. Remember that all these layers are not silver bullets and there's different vulnerabilities that you might encounter. So always be sure to explore different ways of securing your application. Well, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.